Hello and good morning. I'm Barton Poulson, and this is the Data is for Doing live office hours. And I am in Salt Lake City, Utah, in the United States, and it's 10 a.m. and it might snow today. But before we get started talking about data and accessibility issues, I would love it if you all could take a moment to go into the comments and say hello and tell me where you're located. We tend to get people from all around the world. And I would love for you to say hello and we can get started that way. In the meantime, today's going to be a little unusual in that I don't normally have a presentation that I'm sharing, but I've got one that's going to be useful for a good chunk of this. As a quick reminder, I will be having all of this recorded as a video. It'll be available on the various platforms, LinkedIn and Facebook and YouTube, immediately after our session. In addition, I have a LinkedIn Learning newsletter, or rather a LinkedIn newsletter called Data is for Doing. And I'll be publishing that in the next few days, and it will be on the same topic of making data work accessible. And I'll give more information and the references for each of the things I talk about here. So you'll have the video available to you, but also you will have the newsletter with the references in greater detail. In the meantime, let's good morning, or actually good evening in Prague. Thank you for checking in. Bianca, also in Salt Lake City. I'm so glad you're here. Nicholas in Norfolk. And then we have Amit in India. And then Oliver in Canada. Thank you so much for showing up, for being here. I know that sometimes it's a little hard to work with the time zones and to get things working for you. But again, if you're just connecting, I'd love for you to go into the comments and say hello and tell us where you're from. I also know that in general, we have many more people around, and so um, feel free to listen in. Also, again, remember that there will be a video afterwards, and if you're joining us for the first time on video, thank you so much. And don't forget to look at the newsletter I'll have on the same topic in just a few days. That's going to be the Data is for Doing newsletter. It'll be on making data work accessible. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to switch over to a presentation I've created to guide through some of these general principles. So I just have to find the right way to do this. All right. And I got to turn off this banner for a moment. There we go. So making data work accessible. So now, in one sense, data work is always already accessible in theory. And the idea here is that, you've got your computer and you just sit down and you start doing your work and you're good to go. And there actually are a lot of things about data work that make it very friendly and flexible, that do make it possible to do this in certain situations. On the other hand, data work may not always be accessible for a few different reasons. One is logistical. You simply may not have a computer or an internet connection or a stable internet connection or a quiet place to work. And so those can simply prevent it from ever starting. You may have physical limitations. So, for instance, if you have a vision impairment or if you have a mobility impairment, a colleague of mine at the university basically has no fingers, and it makes typing very difficult, although he did get 5 graduate degrees, so he got through all that really well. There can be educational restrictions that make things less accessible. So, for instance, data work is a technical skill and it does require some training, but if you're going to go to a university or even a professional development class, they charge. Then you may not be able to pay the tuition. You may not have the free time available to that. You may be devoting your other time to uh, your work. You may be spending that time taking care of children or spouses or partners or parents or other people. And it's sometimes hard to simply find the free time in order to learn these skills, especially if they're operating on a schedule that the classes are live there at particular times. So this is a live session, but it's also recorded, and I have a newsletter that's available afterwards. And then finally, there can be social obstacles to data work that keep it from being accessible. One of those is I'm just going to generally call it gatekeeping. People not letting you in, people not hiring you for the job or letting you into the class or the program or giving you the project for various reasons. Some of them are really crappy reasons. Some of them, they make sense maybe at first. I can tell you, I'm having a little experience with gatekeeping myself right now, and unfortunately, it means I'm on the gatekeeper end. I'm a university professor, and I am on a search committee to hire a new faculty member. And one of the requirements that we have is that you must have a PhD. And I have a PhD, and we are a university, and I agree that in general, PhDs are a good idea for professors. But man, I can think of so many exceptions to that rule. I can think of people who have PhDs who are not very good teachers. And more importantly, I can think of thousands of enormously talented people who don't have that degree. And it's an arbitrary restriction. And to the sense um, that this applies to data work, say, for instance, a person may say, you must have a degree in computer science or a related field, and you must have 10 years of experience. Well, those are arbitrary restrictions and they can keep a lot of people out. There are a lot of other things that can affect it as well. But these are some of the things that can make data work, which theoretically should just be really free and easy for everybody. These are all different things that can make it much more challenging. But I wanted to talk about something else, specifically, in addition to the logistical and uh, the social. I wanted to talk about neural obstacles, and you may recognize this as one of the phrenology maps. So, for instance, there in the middle above the ear, we have the area of the brain that was associated with destructiveness, and above that, acquisitiveness. But really, the point here is that our brains make a difference. Now, when I talk about neural obstacles or things that can make it so that data work is not accessible, I'm thinking of three very general categories, and I'll have more to say. One is numeracy. That is the ability to work comfortably with numbers. A much more significant version of that is called dyscalculia. Think like calculus. Dyscalculia is a very serious math-related learning disability, and then graphicacy, or more specifically, low graphicacy, which is the ability to make and interpret and derive insights from statistical graphs. I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of these. First off, numeracy. Here in the United States, and I believe the numbers are similar in the United Kingdom, 30% of US adults have difficulty with basic numeric tasks. So if you ask them to compute an average, if you ask them to get the difference between two dates, if you trying to look at associations, a lot of the things that people take for granted um, are not easy for other people. And the important thing to remember about this is different from not being smart. The brain is developed in such a way that you have different capabilities, and a person can be very, very smart and very capable, but certain things are hard for them. I can tell you right now, I'm not able to listen to somebody talking when there's background noise. I get irritated, I get frustrated, and I can't do it. My wife and my daughters are totally comfortable talking to people with background noise or with other things going on. And so I have this limitation. They don't have it. I'm a smart person, but I'm not able to do everything very well. And I think of that as an analogy for numeracy. There's a nearly one third of adults in the United States and the United Kingdom have trouble with what we considered basic numeric tasks. Dyscalculia, the very serious learning disorder, is estimated to occur in somewhere between 3 and 6% of US adults and get similar percentages elsewhere. It varies according to whether you're talking about a situation that is innate, the person was born with it, or whether it's acquired. The percentages and the distinctions differ a little bit, but this has been important. I have had students in my statistics class at my university who have had documented dyscalculia, and I've had to find a way to present the material to them because it is a required course and make it so they could get through it well. And then graphicacy, interestingly, it's got the same percentage as low numeracy. 30% of US adults have difficulty with interpreting basic statistical graphs, which is really important when you're, for instance, trying to make financial decisions. You're looking at growth curves or return rates. And so it is about the same percentages have low numeracy. So there's probably a connection there. Um, all of these can be seen as forms of neurodiversity. You may be familiar with the term neurodiversity. Usually, well, let me rephrase that. Neurodiversity first came up in the context of autism spectrum disorders. And this photo is Stephen Wiltshire, who's a very well known autistic artist who also has savant level skills in memory and drawing. He's drawing right here. It's Mexico City. Gets a helicopter ride over the city for about 20 minutes, and then he will spend several days drawing every single building and every window. It's kind of remarkable. There was a documentary made about him called, I think, Billions of Windows that you can see. Now, neurodiversity can mean different things to different people. So, for instance, I know some people who have ADHD who consider themselves neurodiverse. I have other people who say, well, I'm just going to say I have ADHD. It is an umbrella term that's used in technical literature in that way, but you can think about it as people whose brains work a little bit differently than others in ways that are identifiable and can have an impact on their ability to work with data. So we've got some of these issues, difficulties with numeracy and just mathematical difficulties. uh, could be so as severe as dyscalculia. We have low graphicacy, and then we have other forms of neurodiversity that can impact data work. So, well, there they are. A lot of times, uh, you know, these are permanent situations, and so the question then is, what can be done? Well, fortunately, I have some suggestions. So, number one is to simply try to show some faith. That people who have these situations are often very interested in doing the data work. They're very capable of doing the data work, but you need to structure things a little differently, give them a chance. You know, an interesting example is that there are dozens of well-known writers who have dyslexia, which you think would make, I mean, dyslexia is a learning disability having to do with words. It makes it hard for them to read. It makes it hard for them to write. The poet W.B. Yeats, the author F. Scott Fitzgerald, and John Irving. I realize I'm quoting. Uh, Yeats is Irish, Fitzgerald and Irving are American. Benjamin Zephaniah, a British Jamaican poet. And then Octavia Spencer, an American who is best known as an actress, but does have dyslexia and also has written at least a few children's books. All these people work with words for a living, but they have the disorder that you think would make it nearly impossible for them to work with words at a professional level. Well, here's a statistician who has dyscalculia. Her name is Dylan Lynn, and this is a screenshot from a video interview, and it's on the website. I think it's called Math Made Easy, but I will give you the reference in the newsletter along with other information about her. She really struggles with math enormously and has gone into great detail about how she does her work. And it takes her a lot of time to go through things, But the reason she was attracted to statistics and to data work in general is because there really is a lot more going on than just the calculating. There's the interpreting, the implying, um, the critical thinking, and the social element that goes along with all of it. And that was what was very attractive to her. Her story was sufficiently impactful for me that I I have been in the process of writing a new textbook for my statistics class. I started over again because of the things I learned from her own case story. And I want to share a few of those things with you. So, some of the suggestions I got from Dylan Lynn's own story and from other advice on helping people with low numeracy, some mathematical difficulties, or dysgraphia. Number one, use consistent terms and symbols. One of the problems I've had is that when I teach statistics and I'm simply talking about something like the mean, I can write the word mean. I can use the Greek mu for population mean. I can use X bar for the mean of X. I can, if I'm talking about like GPA, I can put a bar over that and that's a mean. Or I can use a large italicized M. That's the American Psychological Association's preferred symbol for the mean. That's 5 different ways of indicating mean. That variation causes enormous trouble for people. And so I found that it's very important to use consistent terms and symbols. Also to use consistent methods. So for instance, from Dylan Lynn and from, I've since confirmed this by talking with other people with math difficulties. For instance, division needs to always be written as numerator, line, denominator, not with a slash, not with the line, dot, dot, but always this number above that number. Multiplication needs to be written using parentheses, not the multiplication sign, because that can be misinterpreted as an X. And then it needs to be consistent all the way through. And that's something that I'm working very hard on with my new textbook. Next one is avoid unnecessary symbols. If I don't need to use the Greek letters mu or sigma or alpha or beta, if I don't need to use an X bar, then don't use them. Every time I introduce a symbol or something that requires memory, it's going to cause extra difficulties for my students or for people who work in data. Another one was be specific in examples. I've taught statistics for 30 years, and I am accustomed to simply writing X and then putting 5 numbers under it and then calculating the variance for those numbers. I've learned that I now have to say, I can't just give numbers 3, 5, 1, 2. I have to say 3 what, 5 what. I have to always give it a unit. And so I've had to go back through all of my examples and be specific about what this could mean. And then use that as a way of guiding all the way through. This is something that's also very important for people with autism spectrum disorders. You need to be very specific about what it is that you're measuring. Also, what I learned from the National Health Service in the UK is to use numerals and not number words. So if I'm going to have, you know, 5 children, use the numeral 5 and not the word 5, even if it begins a sentence. Standard typographical practice is that if it's a number less than 13, so 1 through 12, is that you write it out. But now I'm using numerals for everything except 0. I do write the word 0 because it looks like an O. And then the last one is to go one step at a time. And that is to, when you're working through a calculation or when you're working through some code, do one thing at a time. It makes it much easier to follow what's going on. And speaking of code, I thought I would show you an example. Now, this is some code I wrote in R, and R is where I do my professional statistical work. But this is the way I've always written it, and it turns out to be really well suited for dealing with some of these issues that I've talked about. Number one is I arrange my code vertically. And so, for instance, in the middle of this, I have a command that says create 2 age groups. That could be written as one very long line. But instead, I do it vertically. Now, I do that in part because I almost always am writing my code for pedagogical purposes. I'm teaching people, and I need them to be able to see what I'm working on. And I find breaking it up, it's almost like poetry, like kind of like haiku, breaking it up into little tiny vertical chunks. And by the way, the pipe operators in R make that much easier. They're basically every language has another thing. If you're writing in Python, you can do the dots and just do the dots and the methods on each new line. Another thing here, as you see, is I comment a lot. There are times that I will comment almost every single line. And in terms of being explicit and in terms of making your data and your code accessible, breaking it into lines and commenting extensively, even though I realize there are some people who say only comment on things that are really important, I comment on everything. And I find it makes my code much more useful to people from a wide range of situations. The last one is this is something I'm doing both for my textbook, but it's also something that can be used for data work in general, and that is to present your insights in multiple methods, multiple presentations. So, for instance, when I talk about calculating regression, I use videos and I use graphics. I have a an picture that explains what each procedure is. I also write it all in sentences. And so I can say, in order to calculate a regression coefficient, first do this, second do that, third do this. And I do it without symbols. I use words, I write it all out in text as step one, step two, step three. And then finally, there are a lot of people who are more comfortable with formulas because they can be so concise and they can see the whole picture in a very small thing. And so I'm presenting each procedure in my class in 4 different ways, with videos, with graphics, with sentences, and with formulas. And the idea is that you can pick the one that works best for you. And that's one way of overcoming some of the limitations that pop in. But to finish up here, the idea is that we've got good data that a lot of people have these variations. Again, the numeracy, the neurodiversity, and probably the single most important thing, because I believe that everybody can benefit from the insights of data work, is to open things up and to promote accommodations, find ways of meeting people where they are in their data work, both in people who want to do the data work and in people who want to benefit from the data work, as opposed to gatekeeping and arbitrary restrictions. And with that, we've got just a few minutes left. And I want to go to a few of these. Stuart says, please, just because you can use a different symbol does not make it useful to those of us with dyslexia. That actually has been a really big issue. This is true for a lot of my students. I, I don't, by the way, I teach at an open enrollment university, and I don't know if learning disabilities are more common at an open enrollment university, but I get dozens of accommodations, and I've realized that the use of the symbols and changing the symbols um, has made it really difficult for some of my people and that I'm working with, and so I'm trying to be much more consistent and also make a way that they can either do it. Some people are really comfortable with the symbols; they can do it with that way. But other people, they can do the entire procedure without any symbols whatsoever by doing the numbered steps. This one, this one, this one. I think that that's been very helpful for them. Now, we've got just a couple minutes left, but I thought I would ask 2 questions, and you can respond to either of these. Number 1 is, what barriers to data work have you personally faced, if there's anything that, or that you know of other people who have faced them? And then related to that, of course, is what solutions to accessibility, what solutions have you found to these? We've got about 5 minutes, but I would love to hear if you've got some comments on either of those. What barriers have you faced or seen others face, and what solutions have you found? And I want to come back to the issue also here, that I realize when I talk about accessibility, it does mean a lot of different things. And it primarily, it usually is used to mean physical accessibility, um, and things like vision impairments, but also social accessibility and initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion are relevant here. And I know that what I was talking about today was only a very small part of that, where I'm specifically talking about issues of neurodiversity and how they affect data work. But it's the one that I'm working on immediately this moment. But I hope to be able to say more about the others. And so if you have a comment about any of those, I would love to hear from it. Meanwhile, I'm going to have a little drink of water. It reminds me, they say that one of the hallmarks of a good teacher is the ability to stand silence. All right. Let's see what. So Stewart says gatekeepers believe that my physical and neurodiversity is a limit. One in maybe 10 employers understands that my challenges are a strength. You know, by the way, there's been a paper that I've now seen quoted at least 6 times in the last 2 days about how about how ADD and ADHD actually confer certain advantages, and they're talking about it within a uh, problems that require very creative and diverse thinking. Um, so yeah, the one thing I've really learned is that it's really important not to ask a person like, "Do you have this degree or do you have this experience?" But can you do this particular job and be much more focused on that. Um, Kelly wants to know, how does this influence when I present data for public consumption discourse? Oh man, I keep my graphs as simple as humanly possible. I focus almost exclusively on graphs. I keep them as simple as possible. And I point to the part of it. And then I say on the graph, this is what this means and what we would do about it. Um, there, I've got I've got an entire course. If you have access to LinkedIn Learning, I have a course that I can't remember the name of, but it's like applied business data in practice, where I really hammer on getting to the point and then making your presentations as concise as possible as a way of getting through. I don't use symbols. I'm clear about what is being measured and what and interpreting things. It does make a big difference. And I can give some references to this when I write my newsletter in the next couple of days. Again, for those of you who came in a little bit late, I also have a newsletter called Data is for Doing, and I will be publishing this month's episode, this issue, in just a few days. And I'll be building on the same theme that we've talked about today. But aside from that, it looks like our time is up. And so I'd like to thank you for joining me today. Um, I would love to hear more from you. If you're on LinkedIn, you can send me a message there. You can also email me. And this is something that I'm going to be working on for the next year. Um, and so it's important to me. And I'd love to share, the things that I find. So thank you for joining me. And I hope to see you again soon. So long.